It was a relatively quick car for the time. Nowadays, oh, okay, there's enough power there. Hello everybody, welcome to number 27. I'm Jack, and today I'm going to be talking to you about two absolutely bonkers British luxury cars. So in the 50s and 60s, Aston Martin was riding high. It had just come off the back of wins at Le Mans, and there was the association with the Bond films as well. But by the early 70s, Aston Martin once again went bankrupt. It was rescued, and in 1974, the factory opened again. Now, coming off the back of a bankruptcy, you would of course think that they would have played it relatively safe. Can you imagine what people must have thought when they saw one of those things going down the road back in the 70s when it was first released? It must have looked like it was from another planet. There were four versions of the Lagonda. The first one was just a stretched Aston Martin V8, also designed by William Townes. But for the second version, second, third and fourth, he completely went to town and did a clean sheet design to achieve this. The Lagonda retailed at £49,000, which was more than a Ferrari 400 or a Maserati Kyalami. On the Series 4 like this one, on top of the changes already mentioned, the body was actually smoothed over. It doesn't have the swage line in the middle, and the corners were made a little bit more rounded. It still looks absolutely mental though. William Townes came up with this design in just 1 month, and it's quite crazy to think that the budget for the electronics on this car were actually 4 times as large as for the rest of the design of the car. So from one utterly bonkers machine, we go to another British creation which is unbelievable in a completely different way. It's actually far more conventional really, this Bentley, but what happened is that Rolls Royce had slowly let the Bentley name die down to practically nothing by the early 80s. Before then, the last Bentleys were merely rebadged Rolls Royces. Only the grille and the badges differentiated them. And they decided, I think, to try and revive it in the 80s by creating the Mulsanne, which then received a turbo engine. So what was essentially a Rolls Royce Silver Spirit with a 6.75 litre V8, they decided that wasn't quite enough, so they lobbed a massive turbocharger on that and upped the power in the original Mulsanne to 300 horsepower. This is the last evolution of that car. This is the Bentley Turbo RT and has over 400 horsepower. Now the Lagonda has a 5.3 litre V8 which produces 280 horsepower. Top speed was 140 miles an hour, and 0 to 60 was a fairly leisurely 8.8 seconds. The Bentley, on the other hand, with almost 600 pound-foot of torque, got this car from 0 to 60 in 6 seconds and had a top speed of 150 miles an hour, which I think was actually self-limited by the barn-like aerodynamics. If you're thinking that the exterior is so mental that to balance things out a bit, the interior is going to be quite conventional, then you'd be massively disappointed, because the interior again is absolutely crazy. But at least on this car it is incredibly nice. I do really like it. It's got some amazing materials, and obviously the fit and finish quality isn't up to the Rolls in terms of standards, but it is quite nice. But it does have some absolutely mental little features. For a start, this car has not one but 2 fuel filler flaps. Is that because it has 2 fuel tanks? No. I guess it's because if you're going to pull up at a petrol station, you can pull up on whichever side you like and it will make absolutely no difference. So 2 separate buttons for that. The switchgear is just scattered absolutely all over the place. You have, there's no rhyme or reason, you have these switches which adjust the seats forwards, backwards. This is the bolster, and then this is the backrest. You have 2 little lovely cigarette lighters, 2 separate ashtrays on each side for passenger and for driver, because you wouldn't want to share. You have your window switches there, and then rear switches there, and then the lockout in the middle. Got your radio, fair enough. Then bizarrely here you have the fuse box. which in a way is fantastic, I suppose, because if anything was to fail, you wouldn't have to get on your knees and go under the car or go into the engine bay. It's all just here. The earlier cars had even madder dashboards, but this doesn't disappoint either. There's some sort of weird trip computer here which gives you some of that information. There's scattered switches for fog lights, lights, and then you get that crazy display. Now, some of them, I think in the Series 2, there was a few series of cars, I'll talk to you about that in a second, but some of them actually had a cathode display, which is the same as the old cathode tube televisions. It essentially had 3 little mini televisions, and it went wrong all the time. The very first car had LED, then they had cathode, and then these ones are vacuum LED, I think. I've forgotten what they are, but it's a little bit more conventional. It is temperamental on this car, but whilst I've driven it and had it, it has actually worked. The Rolls, on the other hand, is just pure opulence. The quality of the interior, the thickness of the veneers, the quality of the buttons, everything is just fantastic. And although there is a massive scattering of buttons, it is more conventional and probably a bit easier to get on with than that crazy Lagonda. Well, now that we've talked about the details, let's see how different they are, or how they compare when we drive them. Now, it feels completely surreal to be driving this car. It's just, the steering wheel is really quite small for a luxury car of this type, and I really like that. It doesn't have the usual sort of massive dish. And it's really easy to drive, which I know shouldn't come as a massive surprise. It is a luxury car. But it does have, you know, it's from a manufacturer with a sporting edge. And it does actually feel quite right, despite the massive size of it. There's loads of room in here. You can hear the engine much more than you would normally think in a car of this type. It's definitely not muted. There isn't a massive amount of headroom. There's quite a bit of softness in the chassis. It doesn't feel unruly. It doesn't feel boat-like like many Jaguars of the time, but there's quite a bit of road noise coming from those tyres, but it just feels like a supreme thing to waft about in. The steering is much heavier than you would normally have in a car like this, and there's loads of feedback as well. I'd be really interested to see how the Bentley compares. You only need a feather to push this along. The 300 horsepower doesn't sound very much, but it's obviously a torquey lump because it feels completely sufficient. But I think one area where it will fall down compared to the Bentley, it's just not as well isolated. You can feel what the suspension's doing, you can feel the noise, and there's a few little very minor creaks and rattles, and while the ride is very good, it's not, with the bigger bumps, it does move the Lagonda around a bit. It was a relatively quick car for the time. Nowadays, ooh, okay, there's enough power there. Just starting to slightly go sideways there. That's just because it's wet. Perhaps the tyres are old, but being such a long car and going straight, very manageable. But I'm going to be quite careful in the corners with it. On the whole, though, it doesn't feel, I thought it would feel quite alien to drive, and it doesn't. It's actually quite nice to drive. It works, I think, as it was intended. It's a nice car to just relax in. There is more road noise than you'd probably want, and you hear the engine more than you'd want as well, in a way. But then again, I think that gives it a particular character, which is quite often absent in any other sort of luxury car. So the Bentley, well, in fairness, although this dates back to the Rolls Royce design from the late 70s, early 80s, this particular model, I think, is a 96 or a 97. It's one of the last Bentley Turbo Rs, and the RT in particular. And it does feel like it is much better screwed together, and just like a much more well-resolved proposition to the utterly bonkers Lagonda. But of course, this car is utterly bonkers in a completely different way, because Bentley chose to get what was essentially a sitting room on wheels and, well, a dining room on wheels, and they lobbed a massive great turbo onto it. But yes, in terms of luxury, the interior is much better laid out in terms of space. There's more space, but up as well as sideways. And it does already, I can tell just from this short little hop here, it does ride a lot better as well. And it is better insulated. The steering is much lighter. The driving position is much more commanding. You feel much higher up. There's more headroom. It's more comfortable. It's more naturally comfortable, I think, than the Lagonda. And crazily, although this car weighs, I think, an extra half a ton, an extra 500 kilos over the Lagonda, you don't really notice it, partly because the steering is so light, but just because the chassis is actually really well resolved. When they changed over from the Rolls, they stiffened up, they increased roll resistance 100%. That's with the front anti-roll bar, rear anti-roll bar, and they had a different, I think, a panhard rod to help tie the back end and stop any side-to-side movement in the rear suspension. And it does feel like really well put together. It is very much like you are piloting a battleship. The wheel sits below you, you've got a great view of the road. The instruments all look absolutely fantastic. And you really can't hear much of that engine, but even the tiniest tweak on that pedal, and immediately you can feel what is there. I'm going to be careful today because I already saw with the Lagonda that has a fraction of the torque and power of this, that on this greasy road it's likely to unstick quite easily. Interestingly, it definitely doesn't wallow anywhere near as much in the bends, despite the fact it weighs so much more. So Bentley really pulled it out of the bag. So the Lagonda is utterly bonkers in practically every single way, and it offers a nicer experience than I was expecting, but you can feel the age of the car. This, I have to say, and I think these go for quite a bit less money now than Lagondas. Lagondas go for upwards of 100,000, depending on which model you're talking about. The RTs, I think you can get a decent one for sort of 30, 40. You can get a normal R for 15. An amazing amount of car for the money. Massive thanks to JHW Classics again, who have lent me both these cars today in order to be able to do this film. I'll put the link to their website in the video description. Thank you all so much for joining me in this little jaunt into the crazy nature that British design can sometimes have. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too. I really look forward to seeing you for the next video. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. It really helps. And I look forward to seeing you soon.